Welcome to Wellness Radio with Dr. Jeanette Gallagher as your host. Her show discusses topics of health, wellness, and spirituality, and is about discovering your place in this great universe, from your cells to the cosmos. Along with her guests, in casual conversation, she strives to ask the difficult questions that may be holding you back from a vibrant life, and shares new ideas that may inspire you to make a change in your life that you only can see in your dreams. And now, here is Dr. Jeanette Gallagher.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wellness Radio. This is Dr. Jeanette Gallagher, and it's a pleasure to have you with us here this evening. Tonight we are going to be talking about the concept of transition, passing through one life into another, passing from human to spirit and soul, perhaps as we would say, death time, transition time, phasing into a next dimension, or perhaps the time when our human body says, it's time to check out, it's no more, and what happens next. The concept of death, the phase of transition, and into the unknown is very scary for many people. It's held in old truths, dogmas, and beliefs, and yet we try to say, but that's what I heard from so-and-so. That's what I heard from another person. Or that's what I think or believe because I'm afraid to think anything else. What are our concepts about when we transition into the spirit, into the soul, into the time of another lifetime? How do we accept, share, and be able to walk through this process with children, with elders, with those who have a sudden loss, the grief, the pain, and the suffering that comes along with it, and the emotional toll that it takes on many of us? Today we're going to be talking about a wonderful children's book, Danny's Day in Heaven, written and illustrated by Marie Antoinette Kelley. When we think about that, as they say, a near-death experience, is it truly those words? Or is it perhaps we actually have transitioned out of our, so to speak, human body, and it's an out-of-body experience versus a near-death experience? Because do we go to the door, step through the door, and how are we going to come back? Is the door slamming shut and we don't transition back? Or is it always this kind of, maybe we say, we had an event in our life, we did see heaven, we felt it, we know what it's about. Perhaps maybe we saw something, we felt something, and now we can bring something back to share with others. Today we're going to be talking about walking through the door. The door will still stay open. What we see as we step into that phase, and bringing back a story. Marie, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us, to be able to share this story, because so many people are now asking the questions. We thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Jeanette. I'm really happy to be here.
So glad to have you because, you know, really what we're talking about, don't you think so many people are asking the questions these days?
Yes, and I think especially in the last 3 years with so much trouble on the global scene, death has been on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, you know, I think that's so true. I mean, people are saying we are unsure of our day, our time, or our age in which we would transition, don't you think?
Yeah, well, what I find so striking, especially, you know, linking it to the scene globally, the boundaries, while death is on our minds with this global pandemic and the whole COVID phase we went through, the boundaries are shrinking, and we are blending our cultures, and we're blending our cultural backgrounds and our religions.
Yes.
And that's what I think people are wondering, well, which version is true? And what I found was, you mentioned the near-death experience, and while we're not sure if that's an out-of-the-body experience or an actual experience of death, evidence is pointing to the fact that it is an actual experience of what happens when we die, because the researchers have compiled the stories that people have brought back from these experiences all around the world. And it shows that, in fact, independent of cultural background or their religion, there are steps that all these people experience, and that they have now labeled as the near-death experience. And these are the incidents or the elements of what we can expect to happen when we die. And I find that extremely insightful.
You know, I think it's so vitally important. Now as a culture, we're starting to talk about these concepts of near-death, of out-of-body, of the phase of transition, of the death experience. Because if you look back in, decades ago, it was never spoken about. People had a lot of fear, grief, shame, regrets, all of that around the concept.
Yeah.
And they thought that was the norm. And they just expected it and carried it through generations. You know, I'm almost 70. I can distinctly remember it. It was always the same way. And for myself, it was like, as being in a medium, I saw it so distinctly different. It's always been distinctly different to me. Ancestors would come to me before they passed. I would feel their symptoms and emotions. They would talk to me. We would share a little bit about it's going to be okay. I'll be there to walk you through. We would walk through after they passed, and it was all good. And yet, there are so many people that are saying it was harsh. Is my loved one okay? What's going to happen when they get over there? I think a lot of people are afraid that they may have not been good people in their lifetime, and that may carry over, and they will be chastised or called out, or maybe, in other words, be even worse on the other side. Do you think that sometimes those human stories is what people are afraid of, first off?
I think when I hear you talking about how it used to be a taboo, I think what has happened on the intellectual scene is that we have maxed out our knowledge, and we are now in a phase where the taboos are getting busted because we're getting more familiar with our feelings and our feeling world. And that's where the fears have lingered about what happens when we die. And as we bust open our own, emotions and our pains and our griefs and then let them go, we're freeing ourselves up to be more sensitive to the subtle feelings. And in those subtle feelings, I think we're getting more familiar with the realm of spirit. And from my perspective, that's the reason why we're getting more insight into the other side, and why death is perhaps less scary for people as they begin to soften into that reality and see that death really is a continuum to our experience of being here in the physical world.
Yes, and your book, Danny's Day in Heaven, is a children's book, but I really liken it and say that it's a book for everybody, because
thank you.
And no matter what age you're at, it's about just attuning something in your thoughts and say, is this a possibility? Can it be this simple? The answer is yes, it can. And can it be this beautiful? Definitely with all of your pictures and colors, the answer is yes, it can. Isn't that the point that we're trying to say, is that simple? It can be colorful. It can be easy.
And graceful. Yes, absolutely. And I think also natural, because as you mentioned, it's our fears that hold us back. It's our fears of overthinking and having our human stories in the way. But those all fade away with the body as the body dies, because fear is the language of the physical plane of separation and of hurt. And our spiritual selves don't carry that fear. They carry the love. And I feel the naturalness of that transition is stunning to people as they phase it, as they are at that step of their transition. Spirit is to matter as yin is to yang. And I feel that these fears and these pains and these experiences belong to our physical self. And then our spiritual self is the inverse, or the implicit part of our own selves. And that wakes up at the point of death if we haven't woken it up already through our exercises and experience as we're living, such as you and I are doing. But I believe that as the body fades away, because that is, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, because it's of the physical plane, the fears go with it. And the stories, it's like, you read in scriptures and in sacred texts and, religions around the world, really, that knowledge that the spirit carries the treasures with them. The experiences you had, they become treasures of mastery and of skill sets, and those come with you in spirit. So you don't fade into blankness and forget who you were, but you have translated your experiences into treasures, and those are of spiritual nature, and they come with you as you transition into the other side.
Right, because if we think about all of our past lives and all of the eons of our soul existence, now in the year 2023, a lot of people are starting to recall some of their past lives. For myself, I live in New Orleans. I can walk down the street. I know who I was, what I was, when it was. Those stories are like movies playing in my head. So
yeah.
I think sometimes people will take, oh, well, that must have been me, and they grab the past life to bring it into the present and start to recreate it, when in essence, a past life was just a fragment of a memory that passes by like a cloud. And I think if we can understand that each lifetime is like a cloud to the soul, then we say, oh, all of a sudden, our heart feels light. We don't have that pressure in our chest. Our mind doesn't start playing all these crazy scenarios. And we just take a breath for a minute, and our palate is clear. That's what we're talking about, is can you get to that space and say, oh, it's going to be okay, right?
Absolutely. And I think the space you're describing with that exercise is that nature, that realm of spirit. And I feel that it's an intrinsic part of our everyday experience. And while I wrote about it in this children's book as the big transition, like, when we die and we come into that realm and the elements we can expect, I also very much believe that what you just said, you can take a breath and invite it in right here and now to reset to that same glory, that same unconditional love and that freedom that is waiting in a grand scale at the end of your life, but that is always present in each moment as you invite it in, the way you just said you would, to reset.
Right. Do you think that sometimes when people, as your character in your book, he was kind of like a bully in his life, a child, and then he had this experience and he came back and he shared it, and he says, I think I need to be a better person. We see that all the time as people come back, and I think the gift, so to speak, in the experience is to be able to share that I'm reflecting. I see my life with different eyes. Don't you think?
Yeah, I remember being very surprised. I got feedback from somebody on the book. Christianity has gotten a bad rap in the last several decades because people have opened up to other religions and felt that some of it is so exclusive. And so this person said to me that it was too Christian to think of the idea that he was a bad person, a bully, and then he wanted to be good. And I thought to myself, what an odd thing to say, because the reason you become good is not because of that idea they were reacting to, that you will be punished if you don't. The reason in the story that Danny is the bully at first is to show you that spirit is unconditional. And while he was a bully, he got access to spirit the same way. It wasn't a reward system, and it wasn't about punishment. But when he saw his life review, and when he saw the consequences of his unkindness, of his bullying, he himself wanted to be part of the love. And so he shed that bullying, and he shed that negativity. And that is not a system of reward and punishment. That's because you're waking up to that power of spirit and that unconditional love that we can, even through breathing, find access to in this moment right now. So I myself felt that it was a powerful ingredient to the story, to see that you don't have to tally up your strikes and wins and calculate if you're going to get access and if you're good enough. It's not that idea at all. It's that spirit is there for us because it's the other side of our own being. And when you are aware of it, you can participate and make it fun for yourself.
Yeah, that whole concept of, are you good enough for God, Spirit, Source? Are you good enough for the next phase of your life? That is something that humans have been putting on themselves for decades and eons.
Yeah.
And I think if we can understand that that's a construct of the conscious mind, we can say the subconscious or unconscious mind is perhaps the dance of the spirit, so to speak. So if we can start to live and say, I allow whatever my human chatter is for today to just silence itself and expand your heart, that's when the soul opens. And that's when you start living as an existential kind of life, as an esoteric kind of life, as a spiritual kind of life, as an awakened kind of life, so to speak. And many people are now starting to branch into the phase of their soul existence in human form, right?
Absolutely, and I think it's further evidence of that. The language of fear is part of the language that we surround ourselves with. Look at the media, look at the politics, right. Look at medicine. It's all fear-based, and so our thinking and our conditioning is fear-based. And from that place, yes, you do what the mind tells you to do. You tally up your score and you say, am I good enough? Am I going to make it? Oh, you're not. And then you react to the idea that you're not and that you're going to hell. And all of that, I do believe, is human construct, or really a misunderstanding of the actual mysteries of spirit, which is very profound once you see into them.
Here in New Orleans, we don't really, per se, have a lot of the heavier weightness around when someone transitions. We have celebrations of life, so to speak, but ours here are a parade, a party, everybody wears white, these kinds of things. And I think sometimes, like when I worked with a patient and she allowed me to share her story, is that, when she said, I said, what do you want to do? She knew she was sick. And she said, I want a new heart. And I said, okay, how do you think that that's going to work out? She says, well, I have this transplant doctor downtown. Here's his name. And I said, okay. So I took the phone number, called up the doctor. The next day we were at his door. Let's talk. Yeah. This famous doctor from Paris happened to be in town. We went to see him. And when we went to see him, he said, I hope you enjoy today, my dear. And she looked at me and she said, is today my last day? He said, enjoy every breath. And we did. And that same day, we drove around town, and she would talk about all her places that she had been and everything, and burning through her oxygen tanks. And we did this, for an entire day. And then she said, I'm tired, let's go home. And we went home. Then she went into the hospital. And then she said, I want to die at home. At 3 o'clock in the morning, her house was full of balloons, all of her friends, party favors, cake, all this stuff. And she transitioned within an hour. I think it's up to us to be able to change the story around the time of people's passing, about chronic illness, about hospice or palliative care, about end of life or near-death experiences. It's up to us, just as you and I are doing today, to change the dogma. Don't you think?
Yeah, and how beautiful that doctor who deals with heart and life and death every day gave her the very simple advice of just enjoy your breath, enjoy your day every day. And that's really probably what it all distills down to, is that we get present in the moment and see the life we have, and then it's not so scary to let it go once the time comes, because more life is waiting on the other side.
I see it a lot, too, with people with Alzheimer's. People will say that it's such a terrible life and everything. I said, perhaps maybe their soul and their spirit is floating up in the top of the room. Their body just didn't catch up yet.
You read a lot of those stories, don't you?
Yes, and I think that's so vitally important. Sometimes you see the struggle right at the end of life, too. And I'll say their soul is in the top of the room. They're just watching as their body catches up, turns its little volume down, and says, okay, we're finished here, and it's time to lock up all the doors, pack up all of the things we don't need anymore, just as you would when you leave your house for a vacation, Shut off the electricity.
And that's definitely what I had in mind.
Yeah, you just shut off the electricity.
When I wrote this children's book.
Yeah, and you turn it around. And I think, is it that easy? The answer is, it's up to us to create our own story. Maybe?
Absolutely. Yes, and that's one of the things I had in mind, because, I wanted children to know the truth about death, rather than, because I was a child who was really afraid of death, and I have a lot of experiences with the other side and with spirit, but I didn't have context for it, and so that created so many questions that it was, I was left in the dark in a lot of ways, and that darkness then became this black hole that death was, and that was going to gobble people up. And I realize there's a lot of children out there who have experiences and who have a connection with spirit, because that's where they're just so freshly from. And knowing the truth of death is going to help them keep that voice. It's my wish that it's going to help them keep that voice alive and strong and have a more integrated experience. And that way, by the time they get to the end of their life and that cup is full, they're not going to have that black hole at that point, because that's what I see with older people in the older generation. They're facing that same doorway, as you mentioned, and they don't have their answers. And as you mentioned already, that unknown is as relevant at that side of the, of the age when you are old as it is when you are young. And so this children's book hopefully is a very reassuring way to turn on the light, to say, trust your breath, trust your experiences, trust the process, and then let your life naturally come to a close without the fear that hovers over us and makes us interpret everything physically. And like there's decay that's only related to the brain, and therefore you no longer exist, and that's so not true.
Right. Also, too, I think the idea that it also allows children, if they are seeing spirits or beings, or if something comes to them and they're speaking to them, like such as angels, or if the godlight, they're sensing it more in their lifetime, in their awakened phase, it also allows them to not have so much fear of that. I know for myself, in the 50s, I used to go outside to play, and right next door was a cemetery. I would go over in there and fall asleep and, lay down and play in the cemetery all the time. That was my life. I was always open to spirit. But there are many that are... because of their parents, grandparents, or their relatives, or whatever it might be, have not had those experiences, the children are a little bit afraid to speak about it. So this book also, too, is a guide to help parents say, are you seeing or sensing anything that's different than what my story is about? Can you share it with me? So in the way, the children are now teaching the older generations to not have those fears of a spiritual life. Do you think?
Absolutely, and it's just that it'd be more natural. And, I myself was a child like that, and I struggled with that, and in that struggle, I found my answers, obviously, and I matured to the idea of the reality of the realm of spirit. And I think that's the biggest obstacle today, is that the world has become so existentialist and so reliant on science alone that, like Nietzsche said, God is dead and we killed him. And that is what we are trying to reclaim. We're throwing the baby out with the bathwater with all our inquiring. Questions are great, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because spirit is real. And when you keep that reality and that language alive, you're so much better off. You're so much better for it.
Yeah. I think sometimes... with children, when there's an elder in the family who's passing on, I think to not expose them to a negative experience that the parent or the grandparents might be having at that time. Because it doesn't have to be, let's continue, I saw that, so that's going to be my phrase that I'm going to repeat, or think that that's going to happen again. So I think sometimes people will say, but we want them to understand what death is, so we're going to show them how the pain and the suffering and all that. And it's like, don't do that, It's because that's your imprint. It doesn't have to be their story. Yes?
Well, it reminds me of a story. When I was a child, as I said, I already had that language alive in me, but I had no context for it. So I myself had a lot of fear of it. And I remember a distinct memory when I was about probably 8 years old. I had an uncle who was dying, and he was dying of Parkinson's, and he had a lot of hallucinations. And we, with the whole family, went to the nursing home to see him. And in that moment, he was quite close to the finish line, but he was really unraveling his sense of self and letting go of his fears. And in his hallucinations, he saw a lot of dark figures, and they were really intimidating to him. And everybody around him was dismissing it as just a consciousness of the body. But I, having had this experience, I saw them with him, and I still remember to this day how intimidating, but at the same time, it was really validating. So it was both feelings at the same time, the intimidation of these are dark fearful beings, at the same time the validation that we could see them together. But because I was a child that had not found my orientation in that world, I couldn't take him past it either. I didn't have the reassurance within myself. So we both stopped at that while we were comforted that we could speak each other's language and nobody around the room could really join us in that. It was a reassurance to be able to fit it, but I think that language can go deeper. And now that I have that reassurance within my own self, I can do that with people. And that's what I'm hoping children and grown-ups who get that language as part of their own inner being can do from this day on.
Yeah. You know, in closing, I had another story where an aunt, she was my godmother, and I had gone to her funeral.
Yeah.
And being the medium, of course, that I am, when I walked into the church and sat down, and then they brought her body casket down the middle, all of a sudden I started wailing. Oh, my gosh. I was wailing like I'm Polish and Lithuanian, and they have banshees, you know, that go out and scream out at death. Yeah. So I was wailing like nobody's business, and I'm going, oh, my gosh. And they had, I was so loud, and I couldn't stop my physical being doing that. And what had happened is that her spirit didn't want to go, and she had, body jumped me, and she was just wailing inside of me. And, to understand, and they took me out of church. They pulled me out because I was disturbing everybody, of course. Right. And I look back on that, and I say, I thanked her so much for that experience, because that continued to open up my soul, my spirit, to be able to do the work I do. And I think sometimes people will say
about that language.
Right, because I think sometimes people will say, but these are negative things, and we have to erase them off the board. You don't want to tell that story again. When in essence we want to, because it helps expand other people with their other stories. And that's what we did today, was you and I encouraged others to share their stories around death.
And to accept the reality of it.
Yes. It's sort of like, what happened when you were young? What happened today? What do you see? What do you feel? What do you know? We want those emotions and those stories to start coming out, yes?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's definitely linked to what we said earlier, that it's the intellect that has pushed it away, but it's our feelings that are understanding it better. And that's kind of left brain, right brain, but it's very much the language of your physical self and the language of your spirit. There are two different languages that we both need to speak, I think.
Yeah. And it's definitely about if you can hold on to fear and say, I'm going to put fear right inside of my hand, and I'm going to close it for a second and hold it close to my chest and say, it's inside of my hand. It's not pushing me. It's not making me do anything. It's not taking me out. It's not, pushing me over the edge. It's just inside of my hand. Then you could say, wow, fear doesn't have that much control, does it? Maybe.
Well, that's a nice thing to do. I like it. Anything that can kind of help you step outside of it is so helpful, so it doesn't overwhelm you and close down your own thinking process.
Yeah.
Or your own feeling world. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think because we think fear is like this big, powerful swoosh that's going to come in, and it's going to push you over the edge of the mountain, and it isn't. It's just inside your hands,
Or sometimes it's like that big wall that says, don't explore here, don't go there because it's dangerous. But actually, there's different kinds of fear. There's the fear of instinct that is definitely part of keeping you alive, and it says don't go there. But then there's the fear of habit and the fear of not having explored beyond the boundary of thought. And that's a different kind of fear that is shutting you down more. And that's a wonderful fear to break through and breathe through and replace with trust and love.
Yeah, I've seen relatives, who were there was no way they had lived such a horrible life. There was no way that they knew in their brain that they were going to be okay when they went to heaven. So they kept, they would drink like nobody's business. And then when, they were in really bad shape, they would call 911. The hospital would save them. And they would go back and keep repeating this process because they were so afraid of death and God's judgment. You know?
See, that's that same system of reward and punishment. It's such a shame when you're caught in that, because that is not how spirit operates. Yeah. Because if you see, I think that's what the book was really trying to put out there, the idea that spirit is unconditionally supportive of you. And when you understand that, then you see your life opportunity as a whole window, like summer camp. Like, what am I going to do with it? What am I going to spend myself, what am I going to invest myself in? How am I going to pay the gift forward? And then you create those treasures that come with you once you get to the other side, and experiences that are rich and rewarding. And that's the idea, that you're set free to live yourself fully by accepting that death is not the end.
Yes. Well, Marie, I think in closing, I think we could share the statement that when you go through the door of transition, the human story, the physical body of pain and suffering is left behind, and you cannot bring all those tchotchkes with you. You must leave all of that old stuff with you, that old story, all of that old stuff that you were holding on to for so dearly. It all stops, and it just goes poof, and it dissipates. It no longer is part of your soul and spirit being. So I think that is something that's comforting to others, and they say, okay, I got it. And then if we can just hold on to that, don't you think?
I sure hope so. I think it would be wonderful to be free to express yourself without the fears.
Yes. Absolutely. Marie, can you share with the listeners how to find out more information about your work and your book? Because it's absolutely wonderful for not only children and adults, and I think it's something that should be read pretty much across the board. It doesn't matter. Don't wait for chronic illness, death, or something that's going on, or on the other side. It's something read today, yes?
Well, thank you so much for that endorsement. Yeah, I have a website. It's makfineart.com, and I have a link on the website of all the places where the book is available, and it includes Beyond Word Publishers, Simon & Schuster, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. You can, if you have a hard time getting to a store, you can order it online. But the book is Danny's Day in Heaven, and I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, and that is under the name MAK Fine Art.
Very good. Well, Marie, it was such a pleasure to have you with us here today, because I think our kind, gentle words takes away a lot of the fear, and sharing stories says, oh, okay, you must have walked the path before. So now we're not into the unknown. We're just into something that says, it'll be okay, right?
Absolutely. And thank you for that wonderful conversation, Dr. Jeanette. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. If you'd like to find out more information about Marie Antoinette Kelley, again, the book is Danny's Day in Heaven. Please do click on the link on the bottom of today's show page to go directly to her website. For more information, check out the book on Amazon or where better books are sold. But also, too, the idea is that to be able to have the conversation now. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for the time and we say, oh, but we don't want to go there? Well, kids, adults, you never know when that time will be. But it's just about being able to accept it into our daily language. Is that we're here today. We are a breath away from transitioning. But it's to say, I'm not afraid. I'm okay. And everyone. It's just about expanding love in the present moment. And can we be open to the idea that, yes, we will be okay? Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Dr. Jeanette Gallagher. Until tomorrow, have a great day.
Today we discussed many life-changing concepts. Who do you turn to, and how do you know what is best when faced with a health crisis? Dr. Jeanette is a patient advocate. She listens to the patient, the doctors, and the family, clarifies the health issues and concerns, then helps the patient make the best choices going forward. If you would like help implementing change into your life and health, we can talk and see where you are stuck and how to improve the quality of your life. Check the link on the bottom of today's show page or visit dr.jeanette-gallagher.com to schedule a phone appointment today.